It's the final, the all-decisive game of the Chess.com Classic. It's Alireza Firouzja playing with the white pieces against Magnus Carlsen. We have seen in the previous video that Magnus had a big opportunity to win the match outright, but he failed, and therefore Alireza Firouzja managed to take it to the second bracket. In this second bracket, it's 1-1, but Firouzja is having a great opportunity. If he wins the event. Well, we will see what happens in this game. And if you do like these videos, just don't be shy. Just hit the subscribe button. Thanks for all your support, guys. It has been overwhelming. And therefore, I should really deliver once again. Here we go. Firouzja opens with 1e4. Magnus goes e5. Bishop c4. It's the bishops opening. Knight f6, d3, protecting the pawn on e4. And black played here the move c6. It's the main continuation. And black is ready to occupy the center with both his pawns. Knight f3, attacking the pawn on e5. But here, black goes d5, attacking the bishop. Bishop goes back to b3. Black is having a great time in the center. And therefore, he got to support its pawn carefully. Bishop d6 is a pretty logical move. And here, white normally continues here with the move knight c3 to put more pressure against the pawn on d5 with the bishop, knight on c3, the pawn on e4. White is trying to get some game here. But Firouzja has a different plan as he avoids the theoretical discussion by playing a more modest continuation, knight bd2. So the knight does support the pawn on e4, but at the same time, this bishop on c1 is hindered, cannot be developed at this point. Well, let's see how that works out. Castling kingside by both sides. And black goes here for rook e8 over protecting the pawn on e5. Of course, white also goes rook e1. That's a good idea. Knight bd7. And here, white goes for the move c3. So that after the move knight to c5, attacking the bishop, attacking the pawn on d3 as well, the bishop goes back to c2. And here, Magnus releases the tension. Takes on e4, pawn takes e4, white recaptures with a symmetrical position. Only one open file. And when there's only one open file, symmetrical positions are often considered to be quite boring. Don't go away. This is going to be pretty exciting. It really matters whose pieces are becoming more active in the next couple of moves. So here, black drops back with the bishop to c7 to clear that d file, and black is ready to contest it very soon. If white, for instance, would move the knight away, then queens are coming off the board, but Firouzja is not interested in that. Played here the move queen e2. And I think this is also an interesting moment, because the knight on c5 is looking quite nicely placed. Although it's not doing too much, it does exert a bit of pressure against the pawn here, but white is supporting that pawn very well. How should black continue? Well, there was one earlier game, Masha Klinova against Sophie Millier, in which the move a5 was played. I think that's actually quite a nice move, a5, so that you're trying to support your knight on c5, so white cannot really kick it away. But Magnus had a different plan. He felt like, okay, can just put the queen on e7 over protecting the pawn, getting ready to connect the rooks very soon. But here, white seizes the initiative with the move b4, attacking the knight on c5. Knight therefore goes to e6. And the knight is looking okay. It's ready to come to f4. But white moves the knight to c4, attacking that pawn on e5 with both the knights, while the bishop on c1 has been freed. And it also does cover the f4 square. But anyway, Magnus comes here with the knight to f4, attacking the queen. And obviously, if white is going to react by moving the queen away, then black is ready to get a bishop out, to get a rook into the game. Black is more than fine. But the critical test of black's play is here, of course, the exchange of bishop for the knight. So bishop takes on f4, pawn recaptures, and these double pawns, it's a typical thing. They're on the f-file, they're not looking too great. And white now has a nice pawn on the e-file, which can come forward, which was played here by Firouzja. He played the move e5. And this is also a very important moment in the game. I mean, we should not forget, it's a blitz game, 10 minutes plus 2 seconds increment. Mistakes are easily made by both players, but it's incredibly complex. Let me try to explain what's going on, because it looks like you're attacking the knight, but you can't really take it, because here the queen on e2 it will be hanging because the queen on e7 and the rook on e8 are ready to strike on e2. So black could actually ignore the threat here by playing something like bishop g4, getting the bishop out, pinning the knight. It's an interesting game. Anything can happen here. But instead, the move knight d5 was played. And frankly speaking, it's probably not the best move. And both sides missed the critical continuation. But what white can do now is this idea. Knight d6. This is a beautiful square for the knight to attack the rook. And the idea is that after bishop takes, you are not going to recapture because then the queen on e2 is hanging. But you have this intermediate move with queen d3. Threatening to take on h7 with checkmate to come. So black got to stop the mating threat and only then you take on d6. With an attack on the queen, the e-file is open and this time it's the rook who's hitting the queen on e7. You can't, of course, take on d6 because of rook takes e8. So this line is working out very nicely for white. If we go back at this point after knight d6, there are a lot of other moves, but in general, white's idea is to, for instance, to advance the pawns from c3 to c4 to c5 to create a huge octopus, which is supported by both the pawns on the e and c file. And another important thing here is knight takes c3, which is not a possibility because of queen d3 attacking the knight, as well as mate on h7. Because if if the knight goes away, queen takes h7, check, king f8, and queen h8, it's checkmate. So anyway, this was a very nice possibility for Firouzja. But instead, he played the calm move h3. He was very happy to prevent black from getting that bishop out to g4, covering the square. And of course, the pawn on c3 is still poisoned. If you do take, it is queen to d3 with a mating threat here. And also the knight on c3 is hanging. So the pawn cannot be taken. Here instead, the move g6 was played. But now the queen goes to d2. So what's the idea? First of all, you do support the pawn on c3 and you're opening up the path for your rook on the e-file, which is indirectly attacking the queen on e7. Bishop e6 was played. Maybe in hindsight, a better idea for black is to move the rook away from e8 to d8 so that the rook is opposing the queen on d2. But bishop e6 was played. Looks very solid, but now Firouzja stands up and played here the best move in the position. Knight to d6. Now the knight lands on this square, which is maybe a surprise. Maybe it had been overlooked by Magnus. But you can't really win a pawn by taking twice on d6. Was not played in the game, but let me show you why. If you take on d6, white captures back with the pawn attacking the queen. If queen takes, then the pawn comes to c4 to attack the knight. The knight can't move away because here the queen on d6 will be hanging. The alternative is to take, for instance, on b4, but then after c takes d5, you are capturing a piece and, well, queens can come off the board. Knight takes d2, bishop takes d5. It is actually still not that simple. Black is having 3 pawns for the piece, which is reasonable compensation, but the double pawn, it's not too great. So white is definitely better in such a position. And Magnus didn't want to suffer in an endgame with 1 piece less. So instead, now the rook is under threat. He decided to move that rook away. Rook e8, but c4 on the board. So now we see that pawn is hitting the knight and the queen on d2 also supports the pawn on b4. So that pawn cannot be taken. The knight got to move. Knight to b6 and here the pawn comes to c5. Not only attacking the knight on b6, but here this pawn also does fantastically support the knight on d6. This knight is ruling black's position. These black pieces, they can barely move. The knight has to move again. It goes to d5. But now the bishop comes to e4. That is a very strong and solid move with the aim of eliminating that knight on d5 so that after that the pawn on f4 can easily be captured. But first, black challenges the pawn on c5 with the move b6. Of course, if you can get rid of these 2 pawns on c5 and e5, then the knight on d6 will be much more loose. But white continues with very powerful play here. Knight d4 is on the board. The knight comes to the center and makes use of the fact that the pawn on c6 is no longer defended by black's b-pawn. So white is threatening to take there with a huge knight fork. Bishop has to go back to d7. And here it is, bishop takes d5. Nice transition, trading off the bishop for the knight. And after black recaptures with a pawn, it's queen takes f4. White is up a big pawn. The two bishops are looking incredibly passive. White's knights are way stronger than its colleagues on the other side. Pawn takes c5, b takes c5. Still white is a pawn up with a passed pawn. How to convert? Well, first we get a battle for the open file. The rook comes to b8. White plays it in a very simple manner with the move rook a b1. Rooks are coming off the board. And black is initiating more exchanges with rook b8. This time white is going to capture. Bishop does take back. And now very nice play by white. So how to break through? You should play on the side where you're stronger. And that is the side with your passed pawn. So the queen really wants to come there. And first it is knight f3, protecting the pawn on e5. So that after the bishop comes to c7, the queen comes over to b4. Knight supports the pawn and the queen is ready to invade on b7, attacking the bishop as well as the weak pawn on the a file. Bishop c6. So all these squares on the b file are now covered. White cannot infiltrate, but here it is, knight c8, attacking the queen and the pawn on a7. Queen goes to d7, knight takes pawn, bishop goes away, but here queen b7, the queen is fantastically placed here, supporting the advance of the c-pawn. Here, you don't have to watch out. d4 is not such a big threat. The pawn is really far away and it's white's turn first. Played here, move c6, attacking the queen. Queen goes back to d8 and here it's queen to b4, attacking the bishop, attacking the pawn on d4 as well. Bishop c2, no need to take here yet because there are always ideas based on bishop b6 for instance. So much easier is just to get your knight back from the edge of the board. Knight on b5 hits the pawn, hits the bishop as well. If you do push the pawn to d3, white's idea had been now to take on c7. Was all not played in the game. Black didn't push the pawn to d3. But the point is now, after queen takes, it's queen d6. The pawn is under control, cannot go any further. Black cannot allow the exchange of queens because the passed pawns are really too strong anyway. If the queen goes away, pawn will come to c7. So white is winning in any case. Bishop instead went to e4, attacking the knight, attacking the pawn. But white's aiming for simplifications. Knight takes c7 is a great idea. And after queen takes, there is knight takes d4. Was played in the game. I should also mention, by the way, that after bishop takes f3 first, you can just take back. And after queen takes c7, queen d6 again. And the queen endgame is easily won for white. So therefore, queen takes c7 on the board. But after knight takes d4, knight does support the pawn on c6. Queen takes e5. White is still 2 pawns up. Queen c4, ready to push the pawn. Only 2 squares are left for this pawn. If you go back with your queen to protect the pawn, the queen is totally stuck, cannot move. White has many good moves or can even bring up the second passed pawn. So black tried its last chance with queen g5, threatening mate in 1. White easily deals with it. f3, attacking the bishop. Queen e3 played. This is a check. Does black have perpetual check ideas here? Not really, but you have to be very careful. And Firouzja played correctly the move king h1. What he should not do is king h2, because then there is this move of queen f4 check. If the king goes back, now there is this trick with bishop takes c6 and the queen is pinning the knight on the 4th rank. Knight cannot capture on c6 because of the fact that the queen is hanging. If you do instead take with the queen, then it's queen takes d4 and this endgame is not won probably. There are too many counter-attacking ideas with the queen perpetual check mechanisms. So instead of king h2, there follow the move king h1. And here all the threats are solved. The king is safe. The bishop is under threat. If bishop goes away, you're ready to push the pawn and white will get the second queen. Black resigned here in this position because if you give one more check, well, there is just king h2. The checks are over and the same problem remains with the bishop hanging as well as the pawn coming forward. So, very impressive game, and that means that Alireza Firouzja managed to win the Chess.com Classic in the second leg of the Champions Chess Tour, bringing home $30,000. Not bad for a couple of days playing online blitz against your big friends in the chess world. So that's pretty cool. Congratulations to the Frenchman And we will definitely see more of him in the future events of the Champions Chess Tour. This event continues in July, if I'm not mistaken, with the third leg. But before, we have many other interesting events coming up as well. So stay tuned for more top-level chess by subscribing to the channel or just make a small donation. Thanks for everyone who has supported the channel already so far. I will be back very soon with more interesting games to cover. Thank you. Bye-bye.